The Orthodox Network presents the 10th Awareness and Education Forum, Suicidality in the Orthodox Jewish Communities, a forum of learning and discussion for communal professionals and leaders, presented on Monday, November 13th, 2017, at the Abe and Ida Cooper Center, 6639 North Kedzie Avenue, Chicago, Illinois.
We've got a busy morning, so we're going to start on time. Hi, my name is Mark Swatez. I'm the Executive Director of the ARC. And on behalf of our entire planning group, I'd like to welcome you all, Jewish communal professionals, rabbis, other leaders, to the Orthodox Network's Awareness and Education Forum. Our topic this morning is suicidality and the Orthodox Jewish community. In many ways, the Torah is an instruction book for living. In the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, we read about God telling Moses, "See, I put before you life and death, good and evil, blessing and barrenness. Choose life so that you may live." It's our hope that this morning's forum will sensitize us all to those who find that seemingly simple instruction so very challenging or even impossible. The Orthodox Network is a collaboration of Jewish social service agencies and providers who work together in partnership to improve services for the Orthodox Jewish community in metropolitan Chicago. The purpose of these forums is to raise awareness and understanding around some of the challenges experienced by the communal professionals working directly with the Orthodox Jewish individuals and families. It's hard to believe it, but this is our 10th forum. Our sponsoring agencies and organizations this morning include JCFS, Jewish Child and Family Services, who is our host this morning, and we're always happy for that to happen. Other sponsors are CJE SeniorLife, JCC Chicago, JVS, the ARC, Jewish Community Council of West Rogers Park. No shame on you, the Response Center, Shalva, and our first-time partners this time, Nefesh Chicago and High Lifeline. A little bit of housekeeping. First, and most importantly, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this morning. We're thrilled that you were able to make it. The food in the back is for everyone to enjoy, so please help yourselves. There are CEUs available for this morning's forum. Michal Cohn and Dawn Levin will be available at the end of the program to help you with that. There are evaluation forms on the chairs on your chairs, along with a lot of other papers. Please take a moment when it's appropriate to fill those out. We really do pay close attention to them, and they help and guide us for our future forums. We take them very seriously. Some thank yous. We want to thank Laura O'Lear and the staff here at the Abe and Ida Cooper Center for making this beautiful space available to us once again. Thank you to Ed Reed, Nikki Skowronski, Deb Lockett, and everyone else from JCFS who have helped in important ways of making this morning possible. Thank you to the members of the Orthodox Network, and in particular to the members of the Forum Planning Committee for all of their efforts. Our co-chairs continue to be Marilyn Siegel, around somewhere, and Rabbi David Rosenberg. Nothing at all would happen at the Orthodox Network without their leadership and all their hard work. And of course, I want to in advance thank our 5 presenters this morning who will be sharing their insights and experiences with us very soon. The Cooper Center is a secure facility, so if you need to step out of the room for any reason, you may not be able to get back in. So right next to the computer on this side here are little pass cards, the size of credit cards. Be sure to grab one of those. That's what you'll need to get back in. If you take one, be sure to put it back. We get into a lot of trouble if you lose them. And so the schedule for this morning. After I sit down, I'm going to introduce Ed Loew, who's the Assistant Director of the NAP Counseling Center, and he's going to introduce and moderate our panel this morning. There's going to be one brief intermission in the middle of our speakers. Ed's going to moderate a question and answer session at the end, and then I'll wrap up with a few closing remarks, and there'll be an opportunity for networking. So the topic. We're very excited to explore the topic of suicidality in the Orthodox Jewish communities. We have 3 explicit goals for this morning. First is to sensitize us about the range of services available to the Orthodox Jewish community and beyond to help our clients deal with suicidality. Second is to gain a deeper understanding of the mindset of individuals dealing with suicidality and the impact on the family system. And third, to get some practical information about the signs and symptoms of suicide ideation. So it is my pleasure to welcome Ed Loew, the Assistant Director of the NAP Counseling Center, who will then introduce our panelists.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Mark. Okay, and good morning to all our panelists. So we're going to get started. I would like to introduce Cara Levinson. There we go. Okay, Cara is a member of the Executive Board of the Illinois chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. She serves as Secretary of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention Illinois Board of Directors, and she is a longtime participant in the AFSP's National Field Advocate Program and frequent presenter at suicide prevention programs to the public, like this morning. Cara's 18-year-old daughter, Ilana, died by suicide in 2007, a tragedy that prompted Cara's passionate commitment to suicide prevention. She's dedicated to removing the stigmas that still attach to suicide and mental illness, and to supporting AFSP's suicide research initiatives. An attorney, Cara is currently working on a book of interviews with people who have lost someone to suicide. And you can follow Cara on Twitter at Cara Levinson. Cara?
Good morning, and thank you. Am I loud enough? Okay. Am I too loud? All right. I think I want to put this up here. This is our tech guru who will be next. Okay. So everybody should have a handout so you can follow along. It's lengthy, but we will not be going in detail for many of these pages, but I do want you to have the information. Okay, so that's me. A little bit about the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. We are the largest private organization in the United States that deals with suicide prevention. We have 4 areas of concern and expertise. One is research. We are the largest private funder of research into suicide, suicidality, and suicide prevention. At the current time, we have more than 70 projects, medical and other kinds of scientific inquiries into suicide-related topics. Often, those people who obtain a grant from AFSP go on to get further and greater grants from the federal government. So we're like good seed money. We also educate the public. We have lots of different programs for schools, for community members, for people in college. So we are a good resource. We also advocate both in Washington, D.C., and throughout all of our 50 chapters. We have chapters in all 50 states. Here in Illinois, we have advocacy efforts down in Springfield. We track mental health-related legislation, and we urge our legislators at every level, including at the Cook County Commission level or aldermen, if that's necessary, to bring suicide awareness and mental health initiatives to the fore. And finally, we raise money. And that's an important thing that we need to do in order to do all of our other work. So that's who we are. So, of course, everybody knows this, but once you're out there practicing and talking about suicide, you begin to realize that there's a tremendous amount of stigma attached to suicide. People tend, even unwittingly, to think of suicide as a choice, as something that is controlled by willpower, and that people who die by suicide are therefore weak. And nothing could be further from the truth. It is a health issue. It is a brain issue. And it is something that I believe, and others do too, that eventually, through scientific advances, we can at least address it earlier on, if not somehow get to the root of the problem and change it internally. And this is true for everyone in this room. By coming here today, you can help prevent suicide by becoming more aware about it. So these are general facts. More than 44,000 Americans die by suicide annually. Suicide takes more lives than homicide, war, and natural disasters combined. We hear a lot here in Chicago about homicides. There are far more suicides than there are homicides, but we don't hear about those for a number of reasons. Firearms account for 50% of all deaths by suicide. Suicide deaths by firearms are greater than other homicide deaths by firearms. So those of you who work with populations that are gun-owning or firearm-owning families, you should be talking to them about firearm safety. You are not going to convince them to get rid of their guns if they're truly that passionate about owning a gun, but you can convince them to think about firearm safety, gun lockers, separating the ammunition from the gun, possibly getting it out of the home while someone is having an issue. Okay. And of course, men and women die by suicide. I've read people talk about this as a man's issue. No, for the women, the people who've had mothers die, sisters die, daughters die, it's not just a man's issue, it's women too. But the greater number of men suicides are by men by far. For every suicide, it's estimated 25 others attempt, and each suicide leaves behind at least 100 people who are affected by the suicide. Estimated $51 billion impact per year from losses to suicide, and also for survivors whose productivity goes down because obviously they're deeply affected by suicide. Suicide death is like no other. You do not get over it. You learn how to live with a tremendous amount of pain. So, we're talking about the middle years. So, M-I-M-Y, MIMI, right? Men in their middle years. And we are going to focus on men in this instance because that's the key part of middle age. There's a discussion about what is middle age. This is a generally accepted but not wholly accepted range, 35 to 64. So that's about 90% of the population, but it accounts for more than double that, right, of the suicides. So more than 40% of suicides are this age group of men. And mostly they're white men. They're middle-aged white men, okay? And that certainly would describe the Orthodox Jewish community, mostly men. So they die at a higher rate, substantially higher rate than either women or younger men. And as my colleague who's going to talk about suicide and people who are older, the elderly, they're not likely to age out of it. You know, people talk about, oh, well, people are going to grow out of it when they're teenagers. They'll grow out of their immaturity, which, of course, is suicide's much more than about immaturity. But again, here, they're not likely to age out of it because there's a very high risk for them when they are older adults, too. Now, obviously, there are other factors, you know, stroke, other old age, heart attack, other kinds of disease that are also at play in the elderly, but there's a high risk among the elderly men. Please, there's no single cause. There's a very natural tendency, and the media only heightens this, to assign a cause to suicide, right? So, oh, well, his girlfriend dumped him, or, oh, well, his business went bad. But the fact is, if that were the only cause, then everybody whose girlfriend dumps them or whose business goes bad would be killing themselves, and we know that that's not true. So there are other factors, and one of those factors is, of course, that at least 90% of people who die by suicide have a diagnosable mental disorder at the time of their death. There are other factors as well. It's a minority of people who die by suicide right? Most people who've had mental illness don't go on to die by suicide, okay? But the key is figuring out who they are, because there's no one presenting. I used to think before my daughter died, and she was a high-functioning depressive, I used to think, well, people who die by suicide, they're lying there all day unable to function, and she was high-functioning. So it just goes to show that is one of many misconceptions. So we do know, and research in the last 10 years has only begun to see increasingly the differences in the brains between people who die by suicide and those who do not die by suicide. There are chemical differences, parts of the brain, you can see it on MRIs of people who are suicidal. Parts of the brains light up more in certain areas. So there are physical manifestations that we can track. Unfortunately, most of the way we know about these things is in autopsy. We hope to be able to get to the point where it's not by autopsy that we can identify people, and that may happen. We are part of AFSP is joining forces with other entities that are working on brain research. So we do look for people who are willing to donate their loved ones' brains. We talk about, well, what happens with a suicidal person? Why? Those of us who do not have mental illness and who do not ever think about suicide ask, how could you possibly get to that point? They're not like you, right? They're different, okay? So they reach a crisis point. Usually it's after having suffered with a mental illness for a period of time. They're unable to get rid of their pain. What kind of pain? Well, for them it feels physical, okay? But it's psychic pain. It's emotional pain. It's the pain that those of us who have lost someone to suicide feel at our loss times 1,000, okay? It is unbearable, okay? And their thinking becomes limited. So that's why when people say, oh, well, if only they had talked to me. Really, okay? At that point, you would have to have been a magician, because what they're doing is basically having like a heart attack, but in their brain. Not to say that you can't do something, and especially for those who are mental health professionals in this audience, but for sure, if somebody is at risk, and if you think that, oh, well, I don't want to better you intervene, and it's not needed, then you don't intervene, and you could have saved a life. So get them to the hospital, get them to the emergency room. Unfortunately, many emergency rooms are not trained to deal with people who are suicidal, but that's a whole different topic. Many risk factors: health, historical, environmental. What others see is a broken heart. We talked about this, but there's so much more that could be at play. For many, there are particular risk factors that help explain some of the reason why this age group is so at risk. It still exists. We may talk a good game, and maybe in the next generation or two, these cultural norms will shift. But right now, masculine identity and behavior historically, and still present for many, many people, about being stoic, about not showing weakness, about being the strong man, and those are hard norms to overcome. It's hard for men to ask for mental health counseling. It's hard for them, oh, it won't help me. I can give myself all the help I need, right? Alcohol, which we know that alcohol abuse is in every community, right? And firearms, those are means of self-destructive behavior that are far more present in men than women. Men, because for many of them, even if they're not the primary breadwinner, they think they should be the primary breadwinner. And so employment issues, financial or legal problems tend to weigh very, very hard on them because, after all, they're the strong one. They should be the ones supporting the family. Intimate partner problems can be a factor. Domestic violence, which we know from Shalva, is an issue in every community. Those can be at play as well. And some of the people who are most affected are people in lower income groups, those who are involved with the criminal justice system, veterans. We get all these Vietnam vets who are having issues, and members of the LGBTQ community. Learn the warning signs, reach out, seek help. What are the warning signs? They talk, not necessarily, I am going to kill myself, although there might be that as well. Do not, if somebody says, I'm going to kill myself, confront them. Are you seriously thinking about killing yourself? By talking about suicide, you do not make them think about it. Or ask them directly if their behavior is problematic. Are you thinking about suicide? Are you contemplating ending your life? Okay? Ask it. Sometimes they just want to be asked. Start the conversation. Studies show that asking about, talking about suicide does not make somebody who was otherwise not contemplating suicide, all of us, oh, hey, that didn't occur to me, right? Assume you're the only one who's going to reach out. That's a hard one. Oh, there are other, well, I know that they're seeing a therapist. I'm sure the therapist will take care of it. My daughter was seeing a psychiatrist, a very expensive one. Boy, did she misjudge that situation, right? So assume that you're the one, the only one that they're talking to about this. Talk about it. You've got all sorts of things about how to talk. I don't want to take up too. And of course, this is for everybody who has a smartphone. Please get these numbers into your smartphone. You may be called upon to be in a situation where you need to give that number to someone, or maybe at some point you might want that number. The crisis text line, that's fairly new. It's because younger people, for those of you who work with a younger population, they feel more safe texting. And there are text lines set up like this one to talk to them in a way that they feel is appropriate and safe. And obviously, we can create a culture, you're doing it right now, that's smart about suicide and preventing it. So thank you so much for your time.
I'm just moving on. Okay. Thank you, Cara. Okay. Our next presenter is Dr. Hanus. Nope, I'm wrong. Hold on. Yeah, okay. Our next presenter, Elyssa Molitor, is a social worker in the program and the program director at Elyssa's Mission, a nonprofit organization based in Northbrook that focuses on suicide prevention education, as we are doing here today. Currently, Elyssa's Mission partners with over 130 middle and high schools throughout the Chicagoland area in order to assist with the implementation of evidence-based signs of suicide. It is an SOS program called the Signs of Suicide Prevention Program. As program director, Elyssa provides hands-on support to schools with SOS programming, as well as supports schools in following a suicide. Elyssa further started a Chicago chapter of Elyssa's Mission, Embrace Mental Health, EMH. EMH seeks to eliminate the stigma of mental illness on college campuses throughout the college SOS program. So, Elyssa, it's yours.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you guys for being here. And Cara, that was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your heart with us and sharing all those facts. I don't know if you could see me, but I was nodding along the whole time like, yes, this is all true, all good information. So Elyssa's Mission is a nonprofit organization. We started after this young girl that you can see in the photo here, Elyssa Myers. She took her life in 2004. Elyssa was actually a really close friend of mine. She started to talk to me about her thoughts of suicide, her feelings of depression at a pretty young age, starting in about 6th grade. And I didn't know what to do, what to say to her when she would talk about these things. I thought that because she was talking about it, she wouldn't do it, or she wouldn't have told me if she was actually considering suicide. But like Cara said, when someone talks about it, take them seriously. I didn't learn what the warning signs of suicide were, what the risk factors for suicide were growing up. And Elyssa made me promise not to tell anyone what she was saying to me. She said, if you tell anyone, we're not going to be friends anymore. And I don't know if you guys can remember back to your junior high years, but friends are everything. And Elyssa was a very good friend, and I didn't want to lose her as a friend, so I didn't share what she was telling me because I knew she was seeing a therapist, and I knew that she was taking medication, and so I assumed her doctor, her psychiatrist, her parents knew everything that I knew. I thought we were kind of all on the same page, and I didn't tell them. What Elyssa's mission does is we go into middle schools and high schools and bring an evidence-based program, the SOS Signs of Suicide Prevention Program. It's a national program. We didn't create it. Screening for Mental Health out of Massachusetts created this program, and we're in over 150 middle schools and high schools throughout the state. The students learn an acronym ACT, acknowledge the warning signs that you're seeing in yourself or a friend. Let your friend know that you care about them. It's the C in ACT, and the T in ACT is tell a trusted adult. That's the most important piece. And I'm able to share my story about Elyssa and kind of give the students permission that if you're seeing these things, if your friend is exhibiting any of these warning signs that we're going to talk about, that it's okay to break that promise and to tell someone, because you could be saving their life. So that's a little bit about our organization, but just some more statistics on suicide, however, focused on teens now specifically. So suicide is the second leading cause of death for young people ages 15 to 24, and the third leading cause of death for young people ages 10 to 14. Right now, in the past several years, suicide among girls is at a 40-year high. In 2015, was said that the highest rates that there have been in the last 40 years. And from 2007 to 2015 alone, the suicide rates have doubled among teenage girls and have risen more than 30% among young boys. Suicide, the 5,900 youth are lost each year to suicide, which is a big number, and that number may not seem like a lot, but it is. Suicides are also often underreported, and with children, with teens, many so-called accidents are in fact suicides. If you look at this graphic, the numbers are a little higher than Cara had mentioned, but they kind of fluctuate, and we also don't even know if these are in fact the most accurate numbers. But for every completed suicide, it's said that there are 45 attempts, and those are only the attempts that we know about. A lot of the attempts aren't reported, and then beneath that, 250 people are seriously considering suicide as an option. There is hope, though. 4 out of 5 people who die by suicide exhibit clear warning signs prior to their death, usually to their friends or family. So to talk about depression and youth, 2.5% of children are reported to suffer from depression in any given year. Before adolescence, equal numbers of boys and girls are depressed, but by age 13, twice as many girls are depressed as boys. Between 10 to 15% of teens have symptoms of depression at any one time, and approximately 12.5% of adolescents, so that's 1 in 8, report experiencing at least one major depressive episode in a given year. So there's a myth out there that teens can't become depressed, that they're just moody, that's just typical adolescent behavior. But as I said before, 1 in 8 teens experience real diagnosable depression. So that's why it's so important that the adults in teens' lives, teachers, parents, know what those warning signs are so that they're able to distinguish between that normal adolescent behavior and behavior that warrants further investigation. So a major depressive episode, I'm not going to go, oh, I didn't tell you which one my handout was. It's 2 sheets, and it says Elyssa's mission on the top. It doesn't go through all my slides, but it gives you the majority of the information that we're going to talk about today. So yeah, 2 sheets. So the reason that we're going to talk about a major depressive episode for a couple minutes is really just to show that a couple things. Depression affects all parts of someone's life. So when we're talking to students, we say, it's going to affect that person at school. It's going to affect their grades. They may have been a good student and all of a sudden stop handing in assignments, start failing their classes. It affects them at home with their family, so they may start getting in fights with their parents or siblings all the time. It's going to affect them with their friends, so maybe they used to hang out with their friends and all of a sudden have no interest in hanging out with them anymore, stay in and kind of isolate themselves, and really have no interest or pleasure in the activities that used to bring them pleasure, that they used to enjoy, sports or the play or chorus or video games or whatever it is, have no interest in it anymore. It's going to affect their eating and their sleeping habits. So again, this is all on your sheet, but when we think of depression, we usually think of sadness, right? But it could also be this irritable parts that come out. So anger and irritability, a lot of times with our younger men. So just to quickly go through these. So not everyone who has depression has thoughts of suicide. If they have depression and it's left untreated, it could lead to thoughts of suicide. And we always tell students, we ask them, how many of you know someone with asthma? And all of their hands shoot up. How many of you guys know someone with diabetes? All their hands shoot up. And we help them understand that depression is the same way. It's an illness, just like diabetes, just like asthma. And who do you go to get treated for one of those? How do you get an inhaler? How do you get the insulin? You have to go to your doctor. And that's really important to kind of explain to them and for everyone here to understand, is that it's an illness just like any other illness. And unfortunately, because of that stigma surrounding mental illness, sometimes it's hard for people to understand that or to really get that concept. More warning signs to look for. We kind of went over these. With the drugs and alcohol, many teens experiment with drugs and alcohol, and certainly as clinicians and parents, you should talk to your children or clients about the dangers of even experimentation. But particular red flags to look out for is if someone is using drugs or alcohol alone, if they're using them to cope with some negative feelings that they're having. A lot of times this can also self-injury. When someone is feeling really strong feelings, maybe guilt or anger or shame, they turn to negative ways of coping, such as alcohol or drug use or self-injury. Excessive risk-taking, so this could be putting themselves in dangerous situations on purpose, picking fights at school, maybe climbing too high on the playground, getting in a car with someone who's been drinking, promiscuous behavior, shoplifting, again, a drop in students' grades, and mostly just overall, it's an overall personality change in the person. So with that depressive episode, especially. So critical warning signs for suicide. With the major depressive episode, those were over a 2-week period of time that you need to be seeing those symptoms all day, almost every day for that 2 weeks. If you see any of these next things that we're going to go over, that demands your immediate attention. You need to do something right away. So talking or writing about suicide or death, as Cara mentioned and as I mentioned earlier, that you'd think that maybe if someone talks about it, they're being dramatic, especially a teen. If they say, my family would be better off without me, or I don't want to be here anymore, I hate my life. Those direct or indirect statements are the number one warning sign for suicide. So a lot of times with teens this is written, so maybe it's in a post on Instagram or on Snapchat, but those should be taken very seriously as talking or writing is the number one warning sign for suicide. Dropping out of school or activities, something that they used to love doing, all of a sudden just quit, really for no reason. Isolating themselves, neglecting their appearance or hygiene. This is usually seen among young girls, maybe someone who used to wake up and shower and do their hair or put on some makeup in the morning and then just kind of stop caring about what they look like, stop caring about that personal hygiene. Need to do something right away again for any of these. Obtaining any sort of weapon, so again a firearm or pills or any sort of means of self-harm. Giving away prized possessions. This was, many of these Elyssa showed us. Again, I didn't know that they were warning signs at the time. When she would give us her jewelry, her favorite clothing, we thought she was being really generous because she was a generous person. But that, in fact, is a warning sign for suicide. Like many adults having a will, this is kind of like a teenager's will. They want to leave things behind to people that they care about so that they can remember them by that thing, or they want that person to take care of that thing, whatever it was, a pet or a computer or jewelry or whatever it is, to remember them. Sudden unexplained improvement in mood. This one's really hard to detect, but it's a really important one. If someone has known depression, has depressed mood, and all of a sudden kind of unexplained energy, unexplained happiness, lots of energy kind of on this high, you want to stop and ask them, are you thinking about suicide? What's going on? And again, that's an okay question to ask. It's a scary question that Cara mentioned. Are you thinking about suicide? Because you're not going to know unless you ask, right? So it's really important. These are not on your sheet, actually, but I want to go over them. So you could kind of fill in parent or teacher or a reason why someone wouldn't get help. So I'm going to wait until they outgrow this phase. The reply that you should say to them is they need medical attention, not time. They're not going to outgrow this. Again, depression is an illness that needs to be treated. I don't want to label my child. You'd seek help for any other medical condition regardless of their implications. If they had asthma or heart disease or anything else, a broken leg, you'd take them to the hospital right away, and it should be no different with depression. My teen refuses to see someone. My teen will be mad at me. Your teen's objection would not stop you from taking them to the doctor for a physical condition. You need to keep your child safe and healthy. I don't know where to go. Ask your school counselor. You can tell them. You can give them recommendations, right, as clinicians. They can ask their doctor. I don't want my child to take medication. I heard it's dangerous, has side effects, hasn't been tested. And that's, not true. Antidepressants, they have been tested. Parents should definitely monitor their children while they're on antidepressants, because sometimes they need to be tweaked. Sometimes that medication isn't the right one and it needs to be changed, or the dosage needs to change, and monitor them for both positive and negative side effects. So this is just a little bit about what we bring into the schools. Again, it's evidence-based. There's a separate middle and high school program. At the end of the program, the education piece of learning the warning signs, the students you go through a brief screener for adolescent depression. It's 7 yes or no questions, asking about possible symptoms of depression, and then ask specifically 2 questions about suicide. Have you tried to kill yourself in the last year, and do you seriously think about killing yourself? And after the students fill that out, depending on their answers, they're followed up with school staff. Alyssa's Mission fully funds this program. We bring it to schools completely free of charge. We also do staff trainings and parent trainings. And that's it. I got the cue to kind of get off. So my information is on that sheet also. But, yep, thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa. Informative having dealt with a number of clients who unfortunately taken their own lives. It's things that we always have to remember to talk to our clients about. Okay, our next speaker, Sharon Dornberg-Lee, is a social worker who's a graduate of the University of Chicago SSA. She's currently the clinical supervisor of the counseling services at CJE SeniorLife, where she provides short-term and long-term psychotherapy for older adults, along with supervision and in-service training. She's also been a consultant for places like Larrabee Hospital, Family Resource Coalition, Sarah's Inn, just to name a few. In her professional career, she's also assisted in providing staff support for the Family Preservation Task Force, a group appointed by the governor in 1993, 1994, so I don't remember who the governor was back then,
Way back there.
to propose reforms to the child welfare system. Sharon, the podium is yours.
Is it okay if I move this down to the lower shelf? Hi, everybody. So I'm not going to do a PowerPoint today. Somebody I know professionally who teaches and does a lot of training, he said, I don't like to use PowerPoints because I think they're kind of emotionally distancing. And so even though I don't share that view, when I don't feel like bothering with a PowerPoint, now I say to myself, I'm not going to do that. It's too emotional. So what you do have on your chairs, though, is a PowerPoint presentation, which is much longer than what I'm going to be able to share with you today about suicide in older adults. And so it has CJE on the slides. And I'm going to suggest you not try to follow along because you'll just find that confusing because I'm pulling from here and there. In addition, there are some green folders in the back of the room. I underestimated the number of you today. And so if you want services, information about CJE services in general and about our mental health services for older adults in particular, please grab one of the green folders at the break or on your way out. Sorry, I don't have enough of those for everybody. Before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge what a difficult topic this is. I know I'm feeling really emotionally stirred by the two presentations that preceded me. It's a really hard topic. And so I just wanted to name that and to thank you for the wonderful work that you're doing, and all of you for being here to talk about something that's so stirring and challenging emotionally to listen to and to learn about and to think about. So you stole my thunder in sharing some statistics about older adults, so I won't make you guess. But older adults are at quite high risk of suicide. And particularly older white men, as you said. The rate of suicide for women typically declines as they age, although in more recent data, middle-aged white women are also at higher risk. That's kind of a newer trend. Older men die by suicide at a rate that is more than 7 times higher than that of older women. So that's pretty startling, 7 times the rate. And as you said, the incidence of suicide among older white men is particularly high, especially in that oldest group of white males who are age 85 and older. It's more than 4 times higher than the nation's overall rate of suicide. So that's something that many people aren't aware of, is that older adults are quite at risk, especially older white males. Part of the reason for this, because people often guess that younger people are at greater risk of suicide, is that younger adults and teens attempt suicide at a higher rate, but they tend to not complete suicide at the same rate. They use less lethal means. So with younger adults, there's 1 death for every 36 suicide attempts. With older adults, there's 1 death for every 5 to 7 attempts, depending on what data you look at. So it's a much higher rate of completed suicide with this population, and firearms are the most common cause, a very lethal means. So some of the special concerns that I wanted to share about older adults and things we need to look at. First of all, older adult suicide attempts, as I just alluded to, are much more likely to be serious. There's a lot less ambivalence. Often older adults who attempt suicide really do want to die. And so they're less likely to talk about it or text about it or post about it, less likely to communicate it. A very high percentage of older adults who do commit suicide go to the doctor within the last month or week before committing suicide, but don't talk about depression or suicide. It's hard to know if that's because they're somaticizing or that there's real pain or illness issues that are a comorbid factor, or whether they might be wanting to talk and not knowing how or being afraid to talk about it. But it's certainly a missed opportunity for intervention in those primary care settings and in the doctor's offices, because that's many older adults have contact and frequent contact with their doctors. Also, the frailty of some older adults makes a suicide attempt much more likely to be fatal. So a younger adult may use the same method and try suicide, but they have more physical reserves. So if they take an overdose, it's just one example, they might be much more likely to survive that than somebody who is already in poor health and quite frail, who can't survive the same type of attempt. So one of the things that's a little bit different with older adults and suicide is that some of the things we talk about as warning signs in younger adults, like giving things away, getting one's affairs in order, can be really normative in late life. I used to joke when I would go visit my grandmother in her later years that every time I got there, something was missing. It was like, Grandma, where's the rocking chair? Where did your sewing machine go? And she was just winding down. She was giving things away. It was a normative thing to do. She wasn't depressed. And older people are always talking about, I got to get my affairs in order. I got to get my paperwork done, my advance directives, whatever. So some of those things can be warning signs, but they may not be. They might be completely normative. So I like to think of risk factors and kind of overall things that we're looking at with older adults that we want to be aware of. So one, and the other speakers talked about major depression is certainly a major risk factor for suicide. Also, past suicide attempts are highly correlated with the risk of future suicide attempts. And then anxiety as well is a risk factor. So we think about depression a lot when we think about suicide. And not everybody in the room has been depressed, but everybody in the room has been anxious, right? We all get anxious. Anxiety, when it's chronic or when it's really severe, is horribly intolerable. So when you talk about horrible psychic pain, severe anxiety can be horribly intolerable as well. That might lead somebody to attempt suicide. Substance use disorders have a high comorbidity with suicide because of impulsive behavior and narrower thinking and options. There are also certain personality traits associated with suicide, and that sort of surprised me at first to learn that, but it kind of makes sense. One is so-called neuroticism, which I think is probably everybody in Jewish Chicago. I don't know what that means exactly. But they go on to describe an anxious or rigid coping style. So it's the idea of a rigid coping style where you can't, you're not open to new experiences or new solutions. You can't imagine a solution. People with more obsessive features. So those kinds of personality traits may predispose people to attempt suicide. With older adults, there's a lot of health issues that can predispose people. And research has found that there are particular types of health issues that can make somebody at higher risk for attempting suicide. Cancer, heart problems, pulmonary problems, respiratory problems, GI problems, which, right, that sounds not that serious, but the chronic pain and kind of narrowing of one's world that can go along with that. Impaired vision is correlated, stroke, diabetes, and also chronic pain, and I'll say more about pain in a minute. There are social contexts that make people at higher risk. One is social isolation, a very important risk factor for older adults that may be more unique to older adults, that they may have no social support whatsoever. But also family conflict, so not just being isolated, even those who have involved family conflict and discord can be a risk factor, and also loss and bereavement. So what I want to recommend to everybody is if you're working with older adults in any setting, it's important to screen universally, not just if you're a mental health provider. There are really brief instruments like the PHQ-2, and in your handouts, there are links to every one of these measures that I'm going to measure. So if you're not in a mental health setting, a PHQ-2 is a 2-question item to assess and screen whether or not people need further assessment and treatment. Whether you're in a senior center or a health center, wherever you are, we should be screening for this everywhere. There are also other measures that perhaps more appropriate for clinicians. There's the geriatric depression scale There's the hopelessness scale, the Beck hopelessness scale, because hopelessness is highly correlated with suicide. So these instruments and assessment tools are really important. So we're not guessing and speculating, and we're really getting to these issues and having the conversation, as the other speakers mentioned. It's really important to assess, have there been past suicide attempts? Have you ever attempted to harm yourself in the past? Does the person have a suicide plan? Have you had thoughts about how you might actually hurt yourself? And that could be information about the timing, the location, the lethality, the availability of the means, and preparatory acts. So these are all things for clinicians to be assessing. And then probability. How likely do you think it is that you'll act on these thoughts of hurting yourself or ending your life sometime over the next month? And then finally, and just as important, are preventive factors. What stops the person? Is there anything that would prevent you from harming yourself? Very important. And when we get to interventions in treating people in a clinical setting who are feeling suicidal, strengthening those preventive factors or creating new experiences and social connections that become preventive factors is really critical. So I just want to echo what others have said. Talk about people and talk about suicidal thinking, including with older adults. It's an absolute myth, as you said, that talking about this is going to increase the likelihood of attempt. If anything, it's going to kind of normalize that sometimes people have these thoughts and create an avenue for dialogue and discussion and treatment. We want to increase social support. I'm always a big advocate in every setting of just trying to help people decrease their overall stress level. We're always at our worst when we're feeling stressed. So it can make the difference between feeling depressed and feeling suicidal if we can just help people to lower their level of stress. With older adults, I think it's really important to try to intervene around financial stress. Sometimes older people are tremendously concerned about finances, outliving their money, living in poverty. Money makes, I think, more of a difference as you get older in terms of what options are available to you for care and so forth. So I think to address financial concerns is really important. And then just working with people to restore hope, I think, is critical. Sometimes I'll say to clients, I know you're not feeling hopeful right now, but I'm going to lend you my hopefulness. That idea that you're in there with them. A wonderful clinician, Patrick Arbor, in San Francisco, who started the Friendship Line, which is a 24-hour warm line and hotline for older adults to call 24 hours a day. You don't have to be suicidal, but you can call if you are suicidal. And that number is in your packet. He said he would ask older adults, how much do you hurt, as a way of starting a conversation. What a simple question that anybody can ask. How much do you hurt, as a way to talk very directly about the pain that people are experiencing. I also think it's really important with older adults to address physical pain issues. And that may be an issue that's more unique to older adults. And sometimes I will just convey to my clients a commitment to working with them to continuing to try to find a solution to chronic pain or acute pain. And sometimes people say, well, I've tried this and I've tried that and nothing's going to help me and this is unbearable. To just, again, to work to restore hope that we're in this together. Let's think of what else we can try. Who else can we reach out to? And I'm going to stay with you until we find a solution. So just that hopefulness that pain can be addressed. Substance use is an issue with older adults as it is with any population. With older adults, there may be a greater likelihood of a misuse of prescribed pain medications. So I know I'm going really fast for time, but that's something else we want to be attending to, is looking at the misuse of medications. And then it's also really important to look for new changes or stressors that somebody who may be chronically depressed or suicidal may experience that would cause them to become acutely suicidal. So if they've had a recent loss or a new diagnosis, those kinds of things are really important. So the point here is that we want to keep assessing and reassessing. Assessment is not a one-time event. We want to keep checking in with somebody and monitoring the level of risk as new issues or losses arise, and to not be afraid to keep having the conversation, which is so critical. So with that, I will leave you. I just want to mention that at CJE we do offer in-home counseling services as well as office-based counseling services, and we bill insurance and that sort of thing. So again, that information is in the green packet. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharon. I think that was very, very enlightening because I think when we hear about suicide, it's so often teenagers and middle-aged as opposed to the elderly. So thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Dr. Stephen Hanus. Dr. Hanus is a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist who is a graduate of Northwestern Feinberg School of Medicine. Dr. Hanus completed his residency at Northwestern, and Dr. Hanus is an attending psychiatrist at Northwestern Memorial Hospital and a teaching faculty member at Northwestern Feinberg School of Medicine. Dr. Hanus, please.
Thank you. I'm asking my assistant to get me cyber connected. Good morning, and I thank you for the privilege of speaking to you. And I think the presentations that we've heard have been quite extraordinary, and I'm honored and sobered by listening to your presentations. And I think that before I begin presenting what I was going to present, much of which has been covered, so I'm going to address another specific issue. And that is, when I was first asked to speak, Rabbi Rosenberg and I spoke about there was a specific need. We are, at this time, mourning several deaths in the Orthodox Jewish community that have hit hard. It's just been in the last several months. People have been shocked. These are families, these are kids who've come from very good families. Confidentiality, we're not talking about specifics and so forth. But what are we supposed to do? I mean, we'll say Kaddish, but we've got to do more than say Kaddish. So I, as a psychiatrist, will talk to you today a little bit in 10, 15 minutes about how I evaluate a patient or when I consult with a social worker or a psychologist or a psychiatrist or an emergency room doctor. What do I do? How does this all work? But I also want to address what do we do as a community, both social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, and the community at large. And what do teachers do? What do schools do to help people deal with the shock of losing someone? And then really impresses the need in the immediate period of doing all the things that you're doing in your organizations. Here you've lost someone. It's terrible. You've been seeing a psychiatrist. And I didn't know that child, Elyssa, but she was also in treatment. You know, as psychiatrists, you hear about all of these things, and you say, what happened? How did it happen? How could it have happened? She said, medicine, seeing a good person. And how did they fall between the cracks? So part of what I want to talk about this morning is what do we do in a systematic, scientific way to try to assess, evaluate, and treat someone who may commit suicide. And suicide is an unpredictable act. As much as we'll talk about risk assessment, the bottom line is we can't predict it. And then the other issue is it's fluid. In other words, we're assessing someone at 10 in the morning, and they may be a certain way, and they may say to us, Dr. Hanus, I don't think about killing myself right now. I don't have a plan. I would never think of something like that. But then in 1 in the afternoon, it can all change. So how do we deal with all that in a systematic way? Well, one thing's for sure. We can't just evaluate what person's saying in the session, in the time. Because think about it. If people are identified as possibly be at risk of suicide, possibly they may need to be in the hospital. Many times people don't want to be in the hospital. Many times people don't want to be in treatment. Many times people want to kill themselves and they don't want to be defeated. They want to be able to commit the act. And you as a psychiatrist or psychologist or social worker, believe it or not, are an adversary to them. But remember, that's just a point in time. So that doesn't mean they're going to always feel this way. So that's where the issue of when we're talking about hospitalizing someone, when to bring them into the hospital or a day hospital is critical to protect them until those feelings pass, until we can treat whatever the underlying psychiatric illness is, whether it be a depression, whether it be an anxiety disorder, whether it be part of a schizophrenic period. Sometimes we're dealing with an acute environmental crisis, okay? particularly the issue of grief. So there's extraordinary circumstances. I share with my wife and kids that every day, if the walls of my office could talk, it's far more extraordinary than you can ever imagine in a novel. So for instance, I know for a fact in the Orthodox community, there was a suicide several years ago of a medical student who had just lost her mother due to a suicide within the 6 months. Rabbi Rosenberg knows about this. And we identified the brother of that medical student. And he was in the community. And what were we going to do? And he had no resources. And he was brought into the minyan at Lakewood Jewish Congregation every morning. And then we connected him to the Ark. And people were watching him and being there for him. And they brought him in for Shabbos and got him through an acute, very, very risky period. And he is now a highly functional graduate student. But if there wasn't an intervention in that 6-month, year period of time, he was at very high risk for killing himself. So with all of that in mind, I'll talk a little bit today about what I do to assess somebody who I get called about. And I see people in my office, I see people in the hospital, I get calls from the emergency room, I get calls from social workers, psychiatrists, and I'll give you some ideas about what you can do to assess in a very difficult process. And anybody who doesn't tell you as a social worker, psychologist, or psychiatrist that it's not a daunting task isn't telling you the truth. And the most important thing, one of the most important things I can tell you in the audience of clinicians here, never try to do this all alone. Meaning, being a social worker, psychologist, psychiatrist can be a very isolating thing. So it's very important for you to connect with other mental health professionals and have a peer group that you can consult with and have a supervisory group. Even if you're absolutely sure you think you're doing the right thing, you still need to talk about this because the bottom line is it isn't predictable. Suicide isn't predictable. And there's going to be times that we make clinical judgments that we regret and we learn from. And part of the other issue that I have to say is we talk about survivorship. It isn't just survivorship of families, but we talk about when a clinician has a patient who attempts to kill themselves, or a clinician has a patient who actually does kill himself. We're talking about therapists who are survivors also, and we're traumatized by it. And yet we can't have these people just retire. Or we can't have these clinicians just avoid seeing suicidal patients, which happens. So what do we do about this? So I think the material you presented has been wonderful. I think you've talked about suicide risk factors. It's in my packet. The things that I would stress about suicide risk factors they're all important, but I think the issue of hopelessness, the issue of a recent or remote suicide attempt, and looking at the lethality of it. So if someone comes in and they say, well, I'm thinking about hanging myself, and I tried a year ago and the rope broke, but I'm okay now. That person's at high risk. When you have a substance abusing patient, one of the biggest clinical mistakes, and I train psychiatry residents and medical students, and ER docs, one of the biggest mistakes that they make is when somebody comes into the ER and they're talking about suicidal thoughts and they're on pot, if they're drunk, if they're under the influence of opiates, you really can't fully evaluate their suicide status, their suicide risk factors, until they're sober. So you actually have to bring them into the hospital and you have to detoxify them in order to get a handle on what their real mental status is. And that's a big mistake. And this comes up all the time. It's a big mistake ER docs make because it comes up all the time after somebody's overdosed and people are saying, oh, I'll never do this again, but they're still under the influence of what they overdosed on. And they're still under the influence of what they've been giving emetics, and they've gotten acute treatment. And those people, they go underground. They're not dead, but they go underground in terms of suicidal thoughts, and then they find a way, many times they find a way to do it successfully the next time. But the key thing is evaluating when do you bring someone into the hospital. So in terms of the things we do to help, we look at what do we do when somebody's acutely suicidal or is at risk for suicide. In fact, I like that term far better because the issue of suicidal can mean many things to many people. One of the things we do is we assess, can the patient benefit from medication? So you might call a primary care doc, or you might call a psychiatrist. That's only one piece of the pie, because medicine can help often. It can also make things worse if you don't have the right diagnosis. So if you have a patient who actually has an underlying bipolar disorder and you give them an SSRI like Prozac or Zoloft, you can actually make them manic. So you have to be sure of you have to try to assess for an underlying bipolar disorder. Similarly, a patient may end up having treatment-resistant depression. So we have patients who go through multiple antidepressants, and it doesn't work. So what do you then do? And this is where referring to a specialist comes in, and we're talking about stigma, so we talk about stigma of things that really can be life-saving, like ECT. So electroshock treatment, people say, oh my God, electroshock treatment, it's terrible, it's barbaric. No, it saves lives. We now have TMS, transmagnetic stimulation. These are newer treatments that can be helpful. And the only way the public is going to know about it is through the help of your organizations, where you say, no, we have to do something. So what you're doing here is a great public service. In terms of other issues surrounding risk factors, what I'd like to do is just go through 2 clinical examples and to show you the issues involved in evaluating a patient, and then try to give you some take-home messages. So, first example, 15-year-old Stephanie is brought into the ER after an overdose of an undetermined number of aspirin. She had no history of psychiatric treatment. Her parents say she's been pretty well, sometimes moody, and she's a teenager. But they couldn't wake her up at 9 o'clock. Her parents went to tell her 2 girlfriends had stopped by. So she's in the ER, and she tells the psychiatrist that her boyfriend broke up with her of 8 months, and she couldn't bear to face him. She wanted to get some sleep, didn't want to die. She didn't recall any plans. Her girlfriends told her parents that she was supposed to go to a party together. Now, the parents are very anxious because they're very worried that she's going to have to go into the hospital. And that's what they're focused on. So how do we do a risk assessment with a 15-year-old like this? And when we talk about all phases of life, you're at risk for suicide. In teenagers, particularly, they're at risk. And when we look at the highest incidence of suicide, we see them in teenagers and young adults. And when you think about it, it's easy to understand when you talk about the limited life experiences teenagers have. So this breakup feels like a total catastrophe to her. So at least for an acute period of time, she wanted to do something very harmful. Now, you don't know what she's really thinking. She wanted to get some sleep. Does that mean that she really wanted to die? We don't know. Do we know how she's going to respond when she gets to school the next day and has to see this boyfriend? We don't know. She didn't tell anybody. That's the most serious thing that bothers me about this case. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't call her friend and say, I've got a bottle in my hand, I'm thinking about overdose. And her parents don't know anything about this. So this is somebody who's never had previous treatment before, is acutely at risk. So the question is, as a psychiatrist, what do? You would like to stabilize her on pediatrics. Then do you bring her into a day hospital? Do you bring her into an inpatient setting? You look at the pros and cons. Obviously, the pros of bringing her into an inpatient setting are that hopefully she's going to be safe there. Hopefully you can get her started in intensive treatment. The cons are you're restricting her freedom. The cons are her parents don't want her to be brought into the hospital. And do you fight with the parents? Do you have to take protective custody? And the answer is sometimes we do. So this is a complicated decision, but this is what we face routinely in the emergency room several times a week for most psychiatrists in the field in taking care of teenagers. I'll talk about another case, which is more of a chronic issue surrounding suicidal thoughts. And we should address what we're going to do with suicidal patients who are having more chronic ideation. So John is a 16-year-old boy who's had a terrible life. He's been removed from his biologic mother at age 6. He's been in a series of foster homes. And he's been in treatment. He's been in outpatient therapy for 3 years. Antidepressant treatment has done little to relieve his depressive symptoms. So this is an example of a treatment-resistant depression. 2 years ago, he's removed from a foster family, and he ended up trying to hang himself. By God's will, the bar broke, and the hanging didn't work. So he saw this as a sign he should go on. Didn't tell anybody about this. He's antisocial. He associates with the delinquent crowd. He's a vandal, burglar. He uses pot regularly, and he started carrying a handgun. Now, his girlfriend broke up with him. He got drunk, and he is now possibly needing to go to jail. So his therapist requested a consultation from a psychiatrist. So how do we approach someone like this? This is a patient who has many of the risk factors that you've addressed. This is somebody who's had a history of abuse or neglect here, a person who's had multiple losses, a person who's substance abusing, a person who's had previous serious suicide attempt, and he has a gun. So what do you do? Well, the first thing is, if he's in a community or he's still in foster care, you have to consult and work actively and mobilize the significant resources that you have. This is somebody who the state is already involved with. There's a social worker. There's teachers involved. You work with all of them because just bringing this patient, he may need to be in the hospital for short periods of time. But just bringing him into a hospital, treating him for 1 or 2 weeks or even a month in the hospital isn't going to cure the underlying issues. This is somebody who has what we call chronic suicidal ideation with more acute exacerbations on top. So we try to convince him to give up the gun. If we can't convince him to give up the gun, we bring him in the hospital until the organization can search his room and get the gun out of there. This is someone, unlike with parents and adults who have the Second Amendment rights, and we have a political situation where this is such an important thing. We have to keep guns. You're quite right. The bigger issue is we're killing ourselves, not just killing each other. Everyone focuses on all the shootings. They're terrible. But 50% of suicides are by handguns. So if we could get better restrictions on this, both with better gun laws, it would diminish a lot of this. Because many of the attempts that we have are through overdose are non-lethal means. When you have a gun, it's not it's lethal. It's over, done, kaput. In terms of other issues with this patient, this is a young man who most likely I'd recommend for a day hospital, on an ongoing basis. So there are day hospitals in terms of services. There are shorter-term day hospitals, some very good ones in the area. I'm not making a plug for a particular one, but Compass, Evanston Hospital, Northwestern Memorial, we all have day programs. Those are 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes several months. But there are also day programs, therapeutic day schools for kids like this. And this is someone who needs that intensity of services. So I can't give you a full course in suicide prevention, suicide risk assessment, but let me give you 3 take-home messages. The first one is, for all clinicians in the audience, don't work in isolation. Have a supervision group. Have supervisors. Go to classes like this. This is wonderful. Secondly, when you're assessing a child or an adult, try to talk to families. 25%, at least 25% of people who end up killing themselves have denied in a face-to-face conference that they have the ideation plan. So you've got to talk to the families. Don't believe, if you have a family member there, don't keep them out in the ER or don't keep them out in the waiting room. Even if a person says, I don't really want you to talk to my family, you got to talk to them. Because, again, they may have the information, the determining information about what you're going to do. And once that patient leaves your office, you may lose the patient. And that's the other issue. Once you've decided that a patient is truly suicidal, you have a massive responsibility. I had a situation 2 weeks ago where I got a call from a psychologist who had a teenager in his office who had driven there. And he was quite suicidal, and he wouldn't let the boy leave the office. And he had to keep him there 3 hours, cancel all of his other patients until the parents could get there. And the issue of hospitalizing, even though we talk about it, it's often a massive logistical issue. To bring somebody in the hospital, you're talking about an evaluation process that can take 4 hours, 5 hours. And then you find out there's no bed. And then you have to transfer. Ideally, there's a bed in the hospital, but there's a shortage of inpatient beds. So it's a major societal issue. And then third issue, and this is just basic, get the guns out. And if we can get the guns out, we cut down on the fatal shooting, the fatal lethal attempts. And so I'll summarize, and I'm sure we'll have other discussion points.
Thank you, Dr. Hanus. I just want to reiterate one of the things Dr. Hanus talked about is supervision, and hopefully nobody in this audience will ever have to be in the position of having had a patient that killed themselves, but I was, and I was a young clinician back then, and I thought, like, I can handle this. In the end, you can't. So you really need to have, when something like this happens to any of us as clinicians, you really need to have a group of people who you can talk to in a supervisory area. I think that was one of the most important things that sort of helped me get through that. Okay, so we're now going to take a little break. We should get back in about 10 minutes, and then we will continue. So have something to drink, have something to eat, and network. We'll see you in a little bit. We're going to get started again, so find your seats. Okay, welcome back. Our next speaker is Rabbi Shmuel Tenenbaum, who is the Mashgiach of Yeshiva's Tiferes Tzvi, where he's responsible for the social, emotional, and academic well-being of its students. Rabbi Tenenbaum acts as a child advocate and counsels students and their parents. Additionally, he serves as a clinical and spiritual counselor for the Yeshiva Tiferes Tzvi alumni. Rabbi Tenenbaum works with children of all ages to give them support, a sense of self, and motivation. He earned his rabbinic ordination and bachelor's in Talmudic law from the Beit Medrash Gavoa Talmudical Academy in Lakewood in 2002. He then earned his master's degree in marriage and family and child therapy in 2009. Rabbi Tenenbaum was a Rebbe in the Lakewood Cheder and then was sent by Torah U'Mesorah to Las Vegas, Nevada to start a preschool which developed into a flourishing day school. He authored, with significant consultation from Rabbanim and professionals, a Torah-based curriculum designed to prepare yeshiva boys for adolescent development. Rabbi Tenenbaum, the stender is yours.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you for inviting me. I would like to start with a disclaimer that Yiddish is my first language. Language in general is a weakness. So please don't judge the content of the presentation by my grammatical mistakes. I want to thank Rabbi Rosenberg, Marilyn, Mrs. Debbie Kardash for inviting me here. I want to start. Recently, I was by a presentation for teachers where the presenters were giving some professional development to the teachers across the frum schools in Chicago. We had approximately 75 to 80 teachers there. And then there was questions and answers. One of the questions were, how do you speak to your students about sensitive topics? For example, if you have a student that comes from a family of converts, he's a ger, and you're discussing in the Torah, you're discussing in the Chumash about a convert. It could be hurtful to the student. It's sensitive. If you have a student that's from a divorced family or from an orphan family, and you have to discuss about a yasam, an orphan, how do you discuss these topics, these sensitive topics? And the senior educators answered that you have to be so sensitive with everything that you say. Anything comes out of your mouth, you have to be sensitive. You may want to prep them beforehand. We're going to be speaking about a yasam. We're going to be speaking about an orphan. And it may be hard for you. If you prep them beforehand and you're sensitive to their needs, you're safe. The MC got up right afterwards and offered, there's a lot of leftovers. Everybody's invited to take home for your wives, take home some food. There were 3 divorced teachers in the room. We could speak about sensitivity. We could speak about how careful we have to be. But we can never be too sensitive, enough sensitive. Thank you, Cara, for sharing your story. There may be many people here in the audience that have suicide or mental health illness close to their family. I'm sorry. And I wish that Kadosh Baruch Hu gives you, Hashem gives you the strength to be able to deal with the challenges and deal with the hardships. But we do have to be sensitive. And I may say things that is not coming from a lack of sensitivity. It could be a lack of understanding the depth of it. So I want to apologize beforehand if I say anything that's may come across as a lack of sensitivity. How did I get involved in being in the field of suicide? There was an organization in the East Coast that recently came across a case study, that in the past year there were about 77 suicides in the Orthodox community. And as soon as I hear of a crisis, I want to find what type of interventions can we put into place early on to prevent some of these crises. So I asked around some professionals. I want to know if anyone has any statistics of those that died due to suicide. What did they look like when they were in elementary school? What type of symptoms did you see when they were younger? I really didn't come out with any clear answers. I tried to find some type of a pattern. And I asked around, and I met with some professionals, and it could be I didn't meet the right professionals yet. But I couldn't find a pattern so we could put interventions into place to avoid future crisis. And I think there is no pattern to suicide. Based on what we heard before, there is no pattern. Death is usually caused by an illness. Sometimes there could be terrorism, there could be violence, homicides, but usually death comes from an illness. If we can understand what an illness is, we can understand what type of interventions or what type of red flags to look for, so we could put interventions to give them the help to deal with their illness, to what they're struggling with. The points that I was asked to speak about is community stigma and denial, trends of increased suicide in the Orthodox community, and some risk factors among the Orthodox community. But I want to share some stories that may highlight the importance of this session, which this session brings awareness. I met one of the community members who happens to be a nursing home owner, and I told him that I'm taking part of a presentation about suicide, and he said, it's not by us. It doesn't happen by us. He said, I do have in my nursing home, I have a few suicides, but they're not from the frum community. It doesn't happen much by us. It's from the other communities. He tells me, and most of those that talk about suicide don't end up suiciding. So it's like they're just attention seeking. And I think these are 2 myths that was painful for me to hear, and I can imagine for those sitting here that actually went through this pain before, it's extremely painful to hear. But it's not coming from a bad place. I got a phone call Friday, Erev Shabbos, right an hour before Shabbos, getting ready for Shabbos, last minute before Shabbos. I got a phone call from a woman that's in Chicago. She calls me that I live in New York. I happen to be here. I had to run away for a few days. Maybe you can help me out. Sure, what type of help do you need? My son did something extremely embarrassing in New York, and I needed to get away. Now we want to get him back to New York, but we want to help him integrate back into the community. So sorry to hear it. What happened? He's struggling, and he's on medicine, and he did something very embarrassing. So he says, excuse me, before we continue on, just to save some time, can you share what he was diagnosed with? So she asked me, do I have to? I said, no. But if we want to discuss a treatment plan for him, then it will be the most beneficial piece that we know what we're targeting. If you just want to have a nice conversation with me, then it can wait till after Shabbos, because it's not an emergency for right now. But if you're calling me right now that we have to discuss something, an incident, so we want to... All right. I'd rather not discuss the diagnosis because I didn't discuss it with him yet. How old is your child? 20 years old. You have a 20-year-old child that the parent is afraid to discuss the diagnosis because of stigma. I'm afraid that he may not be able to look himself in the mirror. This is not coming from a bad place. This is coming from a place that the mother needs a lot of help. And I told the mother, before I meet with your son, or before I talk to your son, we need to meet. We need to talk. If you're only here short term, I'm not the right person. I want you to get to a real doctor. I want you to get to a real therapist, someone that's going to see you and your child and work on a treatment plan. Stigma, denial. But it doesn't start there. A few years ago, I went for my physical. And I went to my doctor. And as the doctor's going through a list of questions, an Orthodox doctor, going through a list of questions, he starts cringing a bit, and I hope you don't mind, I have to apologize for insurance reasons. They make me ask certain questions, nothing personal. If you don't mind me asking the questions, do you suffer any depression or anxiety? And I look at him and I say, not that I know of. Can you tell me more about depression and anxiety? What does it feel like? What is it? And after he said, so I asked, why were you hesitating asking that question? You know, one from person to another from person, you know, it doesn't really happen, but I have to ask insurance. But I said, 1 second. If I would feel comfortable discussing my anxiety or my depression with anyone, it would be my doctor. I would have a much harder time walking over to my Rabbi, I'm depressed. If there was anyone that I feel comfortable, I would go to my doctor. Doctor, I'm struggling. Doctor, tell me if this is normal or not. So where is this stigma and this denial coming from? Again, it's not coming from a bad place. It's coming from a good place. But today, and these presentations are bringing an awareness to the doctor that when I went to the doctor this past year, very easily did he ask me, how do you feel depressed? Are you anxious? Do you smoke? Do you take drugs? What's your sexual life like? And I'm like, oh, we achieved our goal. Thank you. I had a part in educating my doctor. Feel comfortable asking these questions, because if there's someone I'll ask, it's going to be the doctor. So where's it coming from? Let's understand the bit demographics in the frum community. Before we lived here in Chicago, lived in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I did my internship in the Jewish Family Services in Las Vegas, Nevada. And I found a pattern of the clients that I saw there were mostly struggling with some type of a diagnosis of depression. Once I moved out to Chicago, working in the school and meeting with the parents, I realized most of the ones that I'm dealing with have some type of a diagnosis of anxiety. And tried to find some type of a reasoning why there was there much more depression and here there's more anxiety. And I realized that most people that live in Las Vegas, Nevada, removed themselves from their support system, went to move there for either housing was affordable, job opportunity, the air is good for arthritis, gambling community. But the common denominator between all of them is that they removed themselves from their support system and moved away. So when they're struggling and they're going through a hard time, they don't really have a support system. Whereas the families that I'm working with here in Chicago, most of them are bred and born in Chicago. They have their support system here. So even if they're struggling, they have a support system, they have family, they have a rabbi, they have people that they can talk to. One more case study. I'm the Mashgiach, Dean of Students in Yeshiva Tiferes Tzvi. Yeshiva Tiferes Tzvi has a sister school, Joan Dak Space Yaakov. Between our boys' school and our girls' school, we have a bit over 1,100 students. From the 1,100 students that we have in our school, we have about 350 families. From the 350 families, we have 9 families that are single-parent families. 2 of them are widowed. I'm sorry, we have 6 single-parent families. 6. 2 of them are widowed, and 4 of them are currently divorced. From the 6 single-parent families, we have 9 children that are from single-family parents. The 9 children, 5 of them, their parents are divorced, and 4 of them are orphans. Just imagine for a second, the child that's from a single-parent family is less than 1% of the entire school. 1,100 children. You have 9 children from single-parent family. So you have 5 children that the parents are divorced. Can you imagine the stigma of being from a divorced family? When a parent feels like there's trouble at home, one second, I'm from the Orthodox community. It's a very strong, close-knit community. There's a lot of support in our community. I can't get divorced. So they try to stick it out. There is a very strong support system for the Orthodox community. You look at organizations that are out there, any area of struggles, there are organizations, the JCFS, there are organizations for any difficulty that a family may have. There are organizations out there that are helping these families. So you do have a strong support system. Now just imagine how many families would be much better off if there would be a divorce. The children would be much better off if the parents would be divorced. Currently they're living in a house of pain. They're living in a house of fighting all the time. Put down. They may have been better off if the parents would be divorced, but the parents won't want to get divorced because they don't want to be part of the negative percent. So now we could try to understand, where is the stigma coming from? Where is the denial coming from? We're such a strong, close-knit community. Why would anyone think that if someone is struggling, that there's help out there? Get yourself help. But people don't realize that mental health is not just environmental because he's having a hard time. Some people may think that it's environmental. He's going through a hard time. And I remember when I was a child, someone had an episode, a mental health episode. Oh, he had a nervous breakdown. He went crazy. He went crazy. I don't use the term, I don't know, do professionals still use the term nervous breakdown?
Maybe among themselves.
He had an attack. He had an episode. If someone has a heart attack, we didn't say, oh, he went crazy, he had a heart attack. No, he had a heart attack. Now he has to watch his heart. He has to take medication. He has to take care of himself. If someone had a psychological episode, he just has to take care of himself. But in our community, it may look like that if someone is struggling, he went crazy. And it's coming from a good place because there's so much support out there, and I believe if I give more support, then I'll take away the illness. But that's not the case. You can have Lifeline, a wonderful organization that helps people with cancer. You can have March for Dimes. You can have so many organizations that deal with people that have cancer. You can have all the support. But if they don't survive the cancer, you're not going to say that there's something wrong with the person. Awareness removes stigma. The more we are aware that mental health issues, when someone dies due to suicide, is not because he killed himself. It's not because he killed herself. It was a symptom of the illness that the person had. The more we are aware of that, the more we can understand that, one second, what can we do as a community to provide services to these children? If we see that someone is struggling in mental health, it's not just that let's offer more services. Let's understand the child. And when we hear it from the professionals sitting here, let's make a treatment plan to be able to help them out. There are some of the challenges when you do have someone that's struggling and voicing suicide, taking them to the doctor. I remember there was a student that was actually in camp, and he had an episode, and the parents called me up. I don't know what to do now. What do I do now? What do I do now? The camp is sending him back to home. And again, I'm not sure if the camp was aware how to deal with it exactly. So the kid came home, and it was late at night, and I told the parent, we're going to Children's Hospital now to figure out what we can do to help out the child. Children's Hospital? Blah, 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 why the hospital? I said, do you have a way how to deal with this, with his symptoms now? No. I don't either have, but I do know that he needs a hospital right now. But I can't. So I said, I will go with you to the hospital. And we drove together to the hospital, walked them in, and when the nurse asked, what's going on? And the parents started saying, oh, I'm not sure. He's just talking out of, he's just constantly babbling and talking. It doesn't make any sense. And I was able to walk over to say, it seems like he had some type of a psychotic attack. Oh, so now it changed. You need someone to hold your hands. The professionals over here, sitting here, what we should walk out of this presentation is understanding how to hold the hands of parents and of those that are struggling. Don't hide it and tell your 20-year-old child or any age child, oh, it's probably, you're just having some symptoms. Talk to them. Make them aware of what the illness is about. Let them understand it. A family friend that was diagnosed with bipolar, she went to see a therapist, and the insurance changed, so she had to go to the clinic. So she was meeting with the supervisor and the intern. And the supervisor asks her, oh, so you're bipolar? And she says, no, I'm Leah. I happen to be struggling with bipolar, but I'm Leah. My illness doesn't define who I am. I am a person, and I am struggling. If a person could stand up and understand that it's not me, that awareness is a support to the one struggling and to one involved in the person's life. There was a sociologist by the name of Emile Durkheim from France. He wrote a book, a tremendous book on sociology, understand different types of suicides. He differentiated 4 different types of suicide. Egoistic suicide, which is of someone that's not integrated in any group, and then there's altruistic suicide of someone there's excessive integration to group, and as a martyr you commit suicide. There's anemic suicide, where someone was involved in the group, but it was disturbed, integration to society, the person's integration to society is disturbed. And then there's fatalistic suicide. If someone is too oppressed and they feel life is too hard and there's too many demands, and sometimes it could be with a prisoner or someone that's taking his or her religiousness with OCD together, the combination together may make someone feel choked, and it could lead to suicide. But he was a sociologist that devoted his life to understand suicide, and he wrote many books on it. He's from France back in the 1800s. But if you look where he came from, his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather were all rabbanim. They were all rabbis. He was destined to become a rabbi as well. But he left the community because he felt that I want to understand the outside world a bit better. And he went on to become a professor, and then he devoted his life to understanding suicide. Sometimes, someone that removes himself from his community, his or her community, I work with boys, that's why I say. Sometimes when someone removes themselves from the community, they're at a higher risk of environmental depression if you don't have the support system. But if you put yourself into understanding what you're going through, where is it coming from? Become a sociologist, understand what are some of the struggles, write books on suicide, then it gives the person a support, it gives them a value of life, it gives them a meaning. That itself could be a support to them. If you look at the trends of current suicide, a lot of the people suiciding today are people that left the community. They were left the community, from the Orthodox community. Some of the recent suicides in New York were people that were part of the community, but they left the community and didn't have their social group. They didn't have the support system that they needed. Not all of them. But if you devote yourself into a bigger mission, something bigger than life, you do some more research to be able to help others, that can help them as well. I don't know what ended up happening with Emil Durkheim. I do know that he died by age 59. They say he died either from a heart attack or from a stroke, but it came a year after he lost his child in battle. He didn't recover after he lost his child. Sometimes, if you are part of a support system and remove yourself from the support system, as long as you do good work, as long as you do work that will help you out as a person and help the bigger world, it will help you go. But once you have that struggle and you're still missing that support system, it could be very difficult on a person. He died at age 59. But we want to take from his work today to make sure, if we could do anything to help people understand their struggles and understand what may be causing them to act out. It's not acting out. It's just they're hopeless, helpless. They feel that their life is dark. And that's why what we try to do now, and I hope you leave your business cards that I could get some more information. What can we do to today's children to help them with the tools and the skills that when they feel not good about themselves, seek help. Speak to people. And the rabbanim and the educators and the professionals understand symptoms. Understand when the child is asking for help. It's not just, there's something wrong with him. We're a close-knit community. We support each other. And if someone is showing signs, it's not because they want to show signs of trouble, it's because they may be having some type of a mental illness. And be aware of what mental illness is all about. Again, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate the fact that I learned so much here. And I hope with some of the awareness of our demographics, we can understand what are some of the trends in the OTD community, off the derech community. What are some of the risk factors when we see someone that may be single male without a support system is definitely at a much higher risk than someone that remove themselves from their support system is at a higher risk. And just be there, helping hand, and a phone call, as we heard from the professionals before. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Tenenbaum, and thank you, everybody on the panel. I think there's Dr. Hanus. Okay, so we're now going to open up for questions and answers. Hopefully.
I'd appreciate if some members of the panel could speak to two thoughts. One is, I don't want to say the fact, but we see that suicide is sometimes seen as someone alluded to when somebody is very positive when they've been depressed. Suicide is seen as a positive act for some folks, where I'm powerless, I'm hopeless, and I can find relief, where it's not a question of I don't see it as I'm destructing as much as I can actually do something for myself to alleviate my pain and suffering that is not hopeless and powerless. I'd like someone to speak to that, as well as the fine line between ideation and action, because we do see people who have suicidal ideation on a regular basis, but do not actually act on it, and the therapeutic intervention related to that. Thank you.
I can comment on the first part when you were talking about people wanting to reserve the option of suicide or even attempt suicide as a way of asserting control over something that is intolerable. I think that is a factor for many people. I've worked with people who are chronically suicidal, and I think that's often something they kind of keep in their back pocket if things become intolerable, if it gets to the point where I can't deal with this anymore. Or if this, my illness progresses or whatever. So it is a sense of being able to assert control. And I think that's a reality. And I try to both talk with people about that and normalize that part of it feels good. That you have a plan that feels like you can assert some control over your suffering. And then I try to talk with them about what other ways can you have some control over this that aren't so extreme, that don't result in the end of your life. But I think to normalize that thought or that wish to have control over a situation that feels unbearable is really important. I don't know if that's
Good, good.
There were a couple of important points. I'll address the issue of chronic suicidality in a moment. But the issue surrounding an illusion that someone's becoming better in the course of treatment, there's a couple of issues here. Sometimes in the course of antidepressant treatment, you'll see people who are immobilized, they're paralyzed by their depression. Often it takes 2 or 3 weeks for antidepressants to work. But in the second or third week, you sometimes see people start to become more mobilized, seemingly have brighter affect, have more energy. But you have to beware, for some people, they've had the wish, the thought, and the wish to harm themselves, but they just didn't have the mental energy to procure the materials like the pills, the rope, the gun, and then the fact that they've been activated, they have the energy to do it. So that's a dangerous time. The other dangerous time is, and this sounds unbelievable, but several weeks after someone's discharged from a psychiatric unit is a very high risk time for patients for killing themselves. And sometimes it's because people talk about this all the time. They almost have to wait out their time, almost as a prison sentence in the psychiatric unit, to get to do what they want and then defeat the adversary psychiatrist. So it's a very hard thing to do. Then the other issue is people are still they have reemergence of their suicidal thoughts, but they don't want to go back in. And also you have the insurance issues. They may have run out of money for their insurance. So you have all these other factors. And then finally, the issue of chronic suicidality in terms of suicidal ideation. I want to be very careful when I talk about chronic suicidal ideation. I presented it in case 2 here, is that just because someone has chronic suicidal ideation doesn't mean that they're not at high risk. And those are the most difficult patients to treat. So there's a very fine book written by a fellow, you may have heard of him, Andrew Solomon, who wrote a book called Noonday Demon. So this is a fellow whose mother suicided, and he himself has been suicidal for long periods of time. And he would describe how he would go into a unit, and the doctors would say, the point of the treatment is to get rid of all of your suicidal ideation. For him, he talks about this in the book. I'll never not feel suicidal. It's almost like having a rich uncle that I can always go to for a loan. I know it's there in case I need it. It sounds crazy. I use the term crazy, I'm sorry. Okay? But to us, that's the reality is that for the act of killing oneself, it is a psychotic act to most of us. But when you are living in a depressive hell, it's not psychotic. It's a reality, it's an option. And as a therapist, when you're with someone, it's a very hard process, but noticing the subtle changes, always staying in touch with the family when you're with a patient who's chronic suicidal ideation. And then the final thing is, for medical legal reasons, it's for therapists, because we're all dealing with this, is when you have someone who is a high suicide risk, and you have to discharge them from the hospital, letting families know, that they are still a suicide risk, and don't leave town without letting me know. Always have someone there. Let's follow their medicine. Someone checking, but also medical legally documenting. This is you're doing the best you can. And then the other thing is, I was talking about consultation and supervision for us as therapists. When you have a suicidal patient, if I have a patient, actually for many of my patients just long term, I have a colleague see them for a second or third or fourth opinion, because they see something that you don't see. So those are the issues.
Thank you. Sure, go ahead.
I'm curious to hear what type of programming you would suggest putting in place for a community of students and parents after suicide has occurred.
Well, hopefully, this is something that we at AFSP want to see in every school, is that you already have in place a policy of how do you deal with a suicide. And doesn't have to be ours, but if you go on our website, afsp.org, we have a whole kit on how do you deal with when there's been a suicide in the school community. So I mean, there's a lot, you know, you're gonna address the issue, you're gonna bring in counselors, or maybe you can help, if you're up to it, you can talk to the other students about it and why this happened. But the best thing would be that you have done in advance training with your students. And it doesn't have to be about suicide. If they're younger, you can talk about mental health. And this was something that, you know, we really do need to get to the point as a society, it's not just in the Orthodox Jewish community, as a society where we train children that an owie can be, you know, how they feel. And we as parents allow them to voice that. And then we work through the same way that if they scrape their knee on the playground, they're going to tell us about it, and we don't poo-poo it, right? We figure out, is it a little owie or a big owie? It's something that pediatricians should be screening for when they are very, very young. There are children who have mental illness, and they are very, very young. And you just have to be aware of that. I will say, as a parent, you know, we take, I'm a lawyer, and so one of the things that we look at when I had a defamation case, and one of the things that lawyers do is we say, you know, if what was said in this case is susceptible to an innocent interpretation. In other words, if we can interpret what was said that's supposed to be defamatory, if we can interpret that as being in some innocent light, it's not defamatory, right? Same thing, this is what parents do, me included. If I can find an innocent explanation for the behavior, such as, well, you know, she's a teenager, what do you expect? You know, whatever it is, we're not the best judges of what's wrong, and we're certainly not the best judges of how to treat it. So you, as members of a very close-knit community who are able to be objective third-party observers, that's the key, you can help the parent to understand that this is not a reflection on whether this is a good family or a bad family. It's not a reflection on whether people will say, oh, you know, he wasn't loved enough. You know, that may be present in some cases, but it's not all cases. I mean, if there's one thing I know that I don't feel guilty about is that Ilana knew she was deeply, deeply loved, and she deeply, deeply loved us in return. So that's not it's not an issue. More love, right? Oh, by the way, to anybody who says, and this might be a parent who says this, oh, they're just looking for attention. I would respond, doesn't that strike you as a little odd that would be the way that they would want to get attention? You know, maybe that's something we need to explore, is that they want attention and they do it in this way. You know, it's not attention seeking. Yeah. Maybe it is attention. We need attention. We're thinking about killing ourselves. You know?
Just to add to that, when a parent says that my kid's just asking for attention, so if they're asking for attention, why don't you give it to them?
Mm-hmm.
They're telling you what they want. Give it.
One thing to add, we offer grief groups in schools after there's been a student death by suicide. And what research shows in our prevention work is to wait about 6 months after there's been a death to then implement the prevention work. But what we're able to do immediately is offer those grief support groups for close friends of the student who died by suicide.
You know, one of the things you do want to do when you're dealing with school situations, and one of the things we have is we have 3 versions, actually more than that, of this program called More Than Sad. And that there's a version for staff and administrators. There's a version for teachers who are going to teach this program. There's a program for students, and then there's one for parents. because you need to get parents in there. That's actually the hardest group to get in, right? But addressing it up front helps.
There was, to your point, there's specific issues in the community. We're dealing with one now, but I think it was about 5 years ago, there was a contagion of suicides in Lake Forest, where I think there were 4 kids from the high school, or then a recent graduate had gone to the train and killed in the same action, killed themselves in front of the train.
Right.
And it was very frightening to the group there. And we don't understand exactly why that happens, whether it's imitative, whether there's some other process going on consciously or unconsciously. But so there was almost like a SWAT team of mental health professionals that descended. So Northwestern had a program of suicide prevention going into the schools, and really met with the kids continuously, weekly, for a number of months. Now, the crazy thing about it is, and here I've gone and used the term crazy, is when I had patients, I didn't lose anyone in that group, but I had patients who were suicidal, and they were part of that class. And when I went into the school and I met with the teachers, and they said, what can we do for this student? I said, well, he's not focusing real well. Can't concentrate real well. He's behind in his work. I think maybe you need to give him an incomplete or cut down his work, or don't give him all tests on one day. I said, we can't do that. It's not fair.
It's Lake Forest.
Right. It's not an even playing ground. So you need a sea change in terms of the mindset of educators, not just after you've had a suicide, but I can't tell you how many grade school and day school kids who come in and they say, I have 4 tests tomorrow. This is terrible. And I'm afraid I'm going to fail. And they catastrophize. But the teachers don't make it easier. So the idea of really thinking through coordinating how many tests, how much pressure these kids are under.
And just speaking to that situation, you're not an attorney, but I am one. And I can assure you that there are laws out there, like the Americans with Disabilities Act and its Illinois counterpart, which mandate that students who have mental health issues receive reasonable accommodation in the classroom and in the schools. So you can throw that at them.
Yeah, I'm not an attorney, but I have a sister who is. And,
close enough.
Thank you all for your presentations. These slips, like that Dr. Hanus was having about crazy and stuff, I don't want to be the language police, but I think we really have to watch, like I've heard several ways that this has been described just in this one session, like the use of suicidal as an adjective for a person. I think the rabbi spoke to this. Doesn't help. I mean, a person who's having suicidal thoughts or something like that, it's a little more cumbersome, but it has to. I mean, we have to be trained to use the right language when we're dealing with. If we purport to be health professionals, we can't be doing something that actually could be harmful just in the way we speak about it. And that's it. Thanks.
And yeah, and then I'll be quiet. But the issue of language is really an important one. We can see it in the wider community when people are talking about identity issues. You want to address people the way they want to be addressed. Okay. Those of us who work on this issue a lot, we really have sort of universally adopted the understanding that we aren't going to be using the word commit suicide. And there are a number of reasons for that, but one of the ones to remember is you don't say commit suicide because you commit a felony. And of course, years ago, killing yourself was a felony, right? So that perpetuates stigma. There's also the idea that commit is much more of a logical, intentional act when, for many people at the time that they take their own life, they're under tremendous duress. You wouldn't have them explain the contract to you at that time. So it's not commit. Another word is we don't like hearing the word successful, succeeded in suicide. if there's a suicide, there's no success, right? So it's complete a suicide versus attempt a suicide. And the more we can just put it into very plain language, and is, died by suicide, the better. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to speak to what Dr. Hanus said about when we see kids who are under a lot of pressure and accommodation. And I think in the schools, what we see is parents are not forthcoming. We can't help your kid if you don't come to the school and say these are the things that we are struggling with. In fact, we're always working on getting schools to have families sign releases, and let's partner in our relationship to make sure that we're meeting their needs and helping facilitate their treatment plan. Mm-hmm. But a lot of it is schools are really happy to accommodate, but you have to tell them. Mm-hmm. They have to know that they're having a struggle, and because of the stigma, we see a lot of shame and a lot of difficulty engaging parents in partnering with us as the school. And oftentimes we kind of have to work with their ambivalence, and it's the detriment of the student.
Yeah.
I had a question about HIPAA. Dr. Hanus had mentioned about bringing other people in or speaking on behalf of the person that may be struggling. As clinicians, as regular family people, members, how do we deal with HIPAA if we're concerned about somebody's well-being, but yet they're coherent enough or present enough to be able to say, it's a HIPAA violation, I don't want you here, or just the whole HIPAA piece? I was curious.
I can speak to that, but I actually want to expand your question a little bit. And the way I want to expand it is, what is the situation if you have a teenager or an adult who comes into the office and says, I'm having these suicidal thoughts, but I forbid you from speaking to any family member. Now, the thing about what I say at the very beginning of when I work with someone is I say that what we talk about is confidential, unless you start to share with me some information where I'm concerned about self-harm to yourself or others. So I make that clear at the beginning. Now, so with regard to HIPAA, when you're working with children and adolescents, when you're looking at protection issues, certainly you don't need to worry about contacting parents. For schools, you do need their permission. If I'm on a child protection team at Evanston Hospital, if you have a child who is having suicide, or an adolescent who has suicidal ideation, or actually for that matter the parent that needs treatment for any reason, and the parent refuses, you can call JCFS. In fact, you're a mandated reporter to do that. So in those cases, HIPAA can be waived. Or HIPAA, it's not that it's waived, to use exact language. HIPAA provides that it doesn't hold true in the case of self-harm or possible child protection issues.
But that introduction, would that stop them from coming and saying, well, I'm having suicidal thoughts, or I'm thinking of that wasn't the right term, sorry. I'm having thoughts of, I don't like myself, whatever it would be that would make you concerned to reach out to a parent or to someone else. By them knowing that if I say those things, that might have you go and speak to someone else about it, would that stop them from having the conversation?
Well, what you bring up is a very, it's a therapeutic issue, and that many times people will say, I don't really want to tell you what I'm thinking because you then may have to share that with my family. That is a red flag for me there, right there, which means that they're there, you're there. Now, what may happen is once you've shared it with families, they may not want to see you or talk to you again, but you're not doing them any good anyway if you don't act on it then, because there's the famous saying, if not now, when? There's moments in time where you have suicidal teens or suicidal people of any age where you have to act in the moment, especially if you don't have a therapeutic relationship. You know the person, it's different because you know they'll come back. Sometimes you won't see them again. So just be aware of that.
one other point, and I'm not being facetious here at all, but I've been practicing law for quite a while, and I was practicing law when HIPAA was enacted, and I will tell you, I have read the remedies section for HIPAA violations. There is no private right of action. In other words, the parents or the hospital or whatever can't sue you, therapist, because there was a HIPAA violation. Only the federal agency can decide to sue you. They've got other things to do. So, really, wouldn't you rather violate HIPAA and get the parent to hear what you need to say? I'll represent you. Okay? Honestly. I mean, it's really a bugaboo that it should be.
Sure.
This is for Melissa. Before you go into the schools, do you use your agency or do you advise the school to send out information to the parents? Because all I'm thinking about, and I don't know if there is something in the Jewish community, but I know when I was in school there wasn't. But if nowadays, you can speak to this, I'm sure, if people went in and talked about suicide, your phone would ring all night about how could you talk to this about my kids? You're putting ideas in their heads. All those stigmas. So we talk about how education for the kids, for the high schools is so important because, like in your personal experience, you saw it, you didn't know what to do with that. But the parents need to be on board also.
Yeah. So before we do the student programming, we'll train the staff. All staff in the school so that they know the warning signs, risk factors, what to do if a student comes to them. And then we also hope to train the parents on those same things. Before we actually do the programming, we send out a consent letter to parents, letting them know, explaining the program. There's a new parent portal where they can actually watch the video that their parent or that their child watches. Most schools do passive consent. There's been a couple schools that do active consent, and it's really rough. So most schools do that passive consent, letting parents know what's going to be happening. They'll still get phone calls at the school, but mostly just easing their anxiety of what their child is going to watch, what types of things, how it's approved for safe messaging. It's not going to put that idea in their head, and usually that helps. So there is a parent consent and newsletter that goes out with the program before we teach the students. It's a good question.
Have you ever had an experience where a parent will say, I don't want my child in this?
Yeah, and sometimes we say okay because there's high flyers, as we call them, where maybe they've had someone in their family die by suicide, and it just wouldn't be helpful for them to sit in on that, or they've recently been hospitalized, and it would kind of trigger some of those things again. So there's different students that it's okay if they don't sit in, and we talk through with their parents to kind of come up with what that looks like and make sure everyone's on the same page.
Okay. David, you had a question that you were going to pose to the group.
So occasionally it can happen that a young person dies by suicide in the Orthodox community. Any suggestions for what can be said to the Yeshiva? A Yeshiva visiting the family in the morning, or how to respond in a useful way?
I'll tell you what, honestly, and you can do your normal, whatever you would normally say when someone dies, but when I think of the Shiva and the things people said or didn't say, or where they came up and just stood there shaking their head, it was just, there were some wonderful people. Okay, but there were people that were, I could not believe what they said. So if you're going to say something to the mourner, ask them, are you able to sleep a little bit? Are you able to eat a little bit? You know, don't ask, are you okay? Yeah. Duh! You know, of course I'm not okay. But then if somebody said, are you okay? I would answer, yes, I am. Because they obviously don't understand at all. But why would I be okay? So just ask about, because at first you're so stunned. You're, as you would be with any unexpected death, right? You're in unreality. You can't believe that this has happened, not just to you as a parent, it's to my child. It's just mind-boggling. So just, can I get you something to eat? Can I give you, oh, this was a good one. This woman, she does massages. She said, can I massage your back? Would that be helpful? I was like, yes. So those kinds of things, but no words of wisdom, because honestly, unless you've been in my shoes, there's nothing you can say. I had somebody who was a psychologist who did have experience with a patient who died by suicide immediately after his session, which was walked out of the office and jumped out the window. So, which was, obviously he took that very, very hard. But he, who was a friend of ours, when he came, how are you doing? I said, I'm okay. He said, it's going to get worse. A lot worse.
Why, thank you.
So I don't swear externally, however, in my mind. So that's my thoughts.
If I can answer your question, simply because we had this just a few months ago where there was a death in the community due to mental health challenges. And I did not know the family personally, but I heard about it. And it was a bit closer to home because the teenager that had died, it was just 2 months after we had a baby daughter, and they shared the same name. So I went to be Menachem Abel, and I came into the house and I just sat down. I didn't know them, they didn't know me, and I just said, I'm so sorry. Nothing that... But one thing I could say, that you have a commitment that we will do whatever we could to research mental health and bring an awareness to the entire community. And I said that my daughter, with the same name as their daughter, when she will be in school, there will be a program in school already to be able to prevent mental health illness. He just gave me this big hug and he told me, please, when you go home, just hug your daughter for me. We're not asking questions in such a case. We're just there to give them support. I'm so sorry. And you have my commitment that I will do whatever we could to help the larger community.
If I could just add, because there was a specific issue that the Rabbi and I actually talked about at the very beginning, and everything you're saying is very true, and I think the issue of Shiva and observing not only the religious part, but the humankind being empathic. Now the issue at the same time, it's a true tragedy what happened, and we're all here to prevent this from happening again. So one thing that I feel uncomfortable with is it's sometimes in situations like this, and again, I'm not criticizing anyone because it is far from my right to criticize someone, a family member, but to try not to glorify the act, the idea that they are in a better place, that they've been relieved of pain, that they're with Grandma Martha, or Grandma Sarah, or Grandfather Moshe. The idea is not to glorify it, because we worry about that leading to imitative kind of behavior.
Thank you, Dr. Hanus. Well, yeah, just to end, so when David told me that he was going to ask this question, when my kids were growing up, we used to tell, and come on, we have to go make a Yeshiva visit, whatever, and the kids would always say, well, we have no idea what to say, and we would say to them, you say, I'm sorry for your loss, and that's all it has to be, and it covers everything. And you don't have to go and have a conversation, but you just have to let the person know that you're sorry that there's been a loss, and that's all you really have to say.
But do say something.
Right.
Because we did have people who came to the house and sat and ate. And ate and ate. And they never came up to either Michael or me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a generous person, but this isn't a trough.
Right. But that's why to say something, even if it's just that. Well, thank you very much.
I want to thank Ed and all of our panelists. You write in advance. I want to thank everybody for being considered and eye-opening, and I wrote that last week, but, because I knew it was going to be true, but what I didn't know was going to be true was that with 5 panelists, it's very hard not to have a lot of repetition between them. And you all really, took a very different angle, really educated us in a very different ways, and it was really tremendous and very, very educational, inspiring, and really heartfelt. So thank you all, really, for everything you brought to us.
And we're available for other occasions.
The Orthodox Network wants to build on it, so please, you have an evaluation form, please fill that out if you have a second. Thank you for the forum team. If you have a pass card, please leave it back, and everyone have a nice day and a good week.
Yeah, I know, I've got it.
The evaluation, please fill out.